The autumn wind swept across the cobblestones of St. James's Palace as golden. Morning light streamed between the ancient stonework. A steady stream of tourists flowed through the gates, their excited murmurs creating a constant backdrop as cameras clicked and guidebooks fluttered in the breeze. Among them, Guard Darius Cole stood at his post with perfect stillness. His scarlet tunic caught the sunlight, brass buttons gleaming against the vibrant fabric. The bearskin cap added to his imposing height, framing his face strong-featured with a defined jawline and skin the color of polished mahogany. Born to a mother from Sierra Leone and a British father, Cole's journey to the Royal Guard had been marked by exceptional discipline and determination. The ceremonial rifle in his white-gloved hands was held at the precise angle required by centuries of tradition. His gaze fixed forward with a 1,000-yard stare that allowed him to see everything while appearing to focus on nothing. The morning crowd parted almost instinctively around the figure of Alan Whitcomb as he moved with measured steps through the palace grounds. At 73, he carried himself with the ramrod straight posture that spoke of decades in military service. His shoulders were squared despite the slight stoop that age had imposed upon his frame. His weathered face bore the map of a life spent largely outdoors, the creases around pale blue eyes that had once commanded respect and now seemed perpetually narrowed in assessment of a world he increasingly failed to recognize. Whitcomb was dressed in the formal attire of a generation past, a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches worn over a crisp white shirt and regimental tie, polished Oxford shoes that reflected his lingering adherence to military standards of presentation. A regimental pin adorned his lapel, identifying him to the knowing eye as a former officer of considerable rank from a traditional British regiment. Magnificent. Simply magnificent, he remarked to a young family as they paused near the entrance. Been coming here for 40 years, and the standards never falter. That's proper British tradition for you. A passing guard received Whitcomb's approving nod. Good man, straight as a ramrod, just as it should be. His voice carried the cultivated accent of Britain's upper class, each word precisely enunciated as if still addressing troops on a parade ground. As he rounded the corner toward the main courtyard, Whitcomb's running commentary on the excellence of the Royal Guards continued, garnering polite smiles from tourists who recognized the harmless enthusiasm of an old military man reliving his glory days. He paused to explain the significance of certain uniform elements to a group of Japanese tourists, his manner didactic but engaging. Bearskin cap, you see, dates back to the Battle of Waterloo, symbol of the defeat of Napoleon's Imperial Guard. We've maintained that tradition for over 200 years. Continuity, you understand. That's what makes Britain great. His impromptu lecture was cut short as his gaze fell upon Guard Darius Cole. Mid-sentence, Whitcomb's voice faltered, the flow of historical facts stuttering to a halt as his eyes narrowed. The tourists followed his suddenly fixed stare, their expressions shifting from interest to slight confusion at his abrupt silence. "Well, that's certainly different," Whitcomb finally muttered, his previously animated expression hardening into something altogether less pleasant. The nearby visitors sensed the shift in his demeanor, several exchanging uncomfortable glances as the old officer's posture stiffened further. His hands clenched briefly at his sides before he began moving purposefully toward Cole's position. Whitcomb circled Darius's post with the deliberate pace of an officer conducting an inspection, his critical gaze traveling from the guard's boots to the top of his bearskin cap. Tourists continued to pose for photographs nearby, though several noticed the unusual scrutiny being applied by the elderly gentleman in tweed. "Standards have certainly changed," Whitcomb muttered, his voice gradually increasing in volume as if testing whether his comments might provoke a reaction. "In my day, there were traditions about who could stand guard here. Proper traditions." A young woman with a guidebook frowned slightly, overhearing the comment as she guided her children past. Whitcomb paid her no mind, continuing his circuit around Darius's position. The Queen's Guard represents the finest of British heritage, he announced to no one in particular, though his voice carried across the courtyard, dating back to 1660 centuries of unbroken lineage and tradition. Darius remained perfectly still, his discipline unshaken as Whitcomb moved increasingly closer. The old officer's scrutiny became more pointed, his movements more deliberately invasive of the customary space afforded to guards on duty. "I served with the 5th Regiment for 34 years, Whitcomb declared, addressing a small group of American tourists who had paused to watch the unusual interaction. "From Aden to Northern Ireland. Back then, we understood what it meant to preserve traditions." His gaze returned to Darius, lingering on his face with unmistakable disapproval. "See, the regiments had standards, proper bloodlines, if you understand my meaning, men from the right sort of families." An elderly tourist stepped forward, his Australian accent cutting through Whitcomb's monologue. "Excuse me, sir, but I think we should give the guard his space. It's disrespectful to crowd him." Whitcomb turned, drawing himself up to his full height. "I was a lieutenant colonel in Her Majesty's Armed Forces, sir. I believe I understand protocol regarding the Royal Guard better than most." His dismissive tone left no room for argument as he turned back to Darius. "When I led men, we had clear understandings about who could serve in ceremonial positions. Appearances mattered." His emphasis on the word appearances carried unmistakable meaning. The face of Britain's military tradition should reflect Britain's traditions. Wouldn't you agree? Darius maintained his forward gaze, his discipline absolute, despite the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere developing around his post. The muscles in his jaw might have tensed slightly, the only possible reaction to Whitcomb's provocation, but even this was imperceptible to casual observers. "I suppose times change," Whitcomb said, with exaggerated resignation, though not always for the better. "Some traditions shouldn't be diluted." With a final disapproving glance, he stepped back, giving Darius a mock salute that bordered on insulting in its exaggerated motion. "Carry on, then. Guardsman if. That's what they're calling it these days." The tourists around them shifted uncomfortably, several moving away from what was becoming an increasingly tense situation while others lingered, uncertain whether intervention was appropriate. Whitcomb retreated to a nearby bench, his expression thunderous as he observed the flow of tourists around Darius's post. For several minutes he appeared to be simply resting, occasionally acknowledging passers-by with a curt nod. But his gaze repeatedly returned to Darius, his disapproval evident in the hard set of his jaw and the drumming of fingers against his knee. After several minutes Whitcomb rose and strode back toward Darius's position, his restraint visibly abandoned. "You know," he announced loudly, "my grandfather served in the colonial service in West Africa, had dozens of men under his command who looked rather like you." The deliberate emphasis made his meaning unmistakable. They were servants, of course, knew their proper place. Whitcomb rounded on him. "This is between military men, civilian. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns anyone who doesn't want to hear that kind of talk in public," the man replied firmly. Several tourists murmured in agreement, forming a loose semicircle around the confrontation. Whitcomb surveyed them with contempt. "Modern sensibilities," he scoffed. "You've forgotten what made Britain great. When I commanded men in Aden, we understood the proper hierarchy. Men like him," he gestured dismissively toward Darius, "served under proper British officers. They didn't stand guard over our royal traditions." He turned back to Darius, stepping closer than protocol allowed. "I earned my commission at Sandhurst when standards still meant something. 34 years serving Queen and country. I was decorated twice for valor in combat operations. You couldn't begin to understand." He leaned slightly forward, examining Darius's uniform insignia. "Staff sergeant, is it? In my day, you'd never have received a stripe. let alone stood post at the palace. Your kind were assigned appropriate duties, cooking, carrying, cleaning, not representing the crown. The semicircle of concerned tourists had grown, many recording the incident on their phones while others looked around for security personnel. Palace staff had noticed the disturbance and were conferring nearby, clearly monitoring the situation while assessing the appropriate response to a confrontation involving an elderly former officer. The empire was built on order, Whitcomb declared, shifting from personal attack to historical lecture. Everyone in their proper station. The moment we forgot that, everything began to crumble. And now look, they've even changed the guard to suit modern politics. Whitcomb stepped directly into Darius's personal space, close enough that his breath was visible as small puffs of condensation in the cool autumn air between them. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper, though still audible to the nearest onlookers. Stand aside, guardsman. That's an order from a superior officer. The command was delivered with the absolute expectation of compliance, as if decades of retirement had done nothing to diminish his authority. You have no business wearing that uniform or standing at this post. Darius remained motionless, his training holding firm despite the unprecedented provocation. The only sign of his awareness was a slight adjustment in his breathing, controlled and measured, the technique of a soldier managing stress in a combat situation. I said stand aside. Whitcomb's voice rose sharply, drawing the attention of tourists across the courtyard. Your presence here is an insult to every man who properly served before you. Your ancestors would have been carrying water for real soldiers, not pretending to be one. He circled Darius again, his assessment deliberately degrading. Look at him. Everyone, this is what happens when tradition falls to political correctness. A costume on someone who doesn't understand what it represents. Several palace security personnel had begun moving toward the confrontation, their approach measured but purposeful. Sensing their advance, Whitcomb escalated further, determined to provoke a response before intervention could occur. My grandfather owned men like you in Sierra Leone, he stated, his wild guess at Darius's heritage revealing both his prejudice and ignorance. They worked his plantation and knew their place in the world. They certainly didn't stand guard at the palace. An elderly woman gasped audibly at the comment, while a young British Asian man stepped forward, only to be restrained by his companion, who whispered something about not making it worse. I commanded real British soldiers, Whitcomb continued, his complexion reddening with each unanswered provocation. Men from proper families, with military histories going back generations. What's your lineage, boy? Cotton pickers? Tribal warriors? Certainly not soldiers of the crown. The security personnel had nearly reached them when Whitcomb, in a final desperate attempt to provoke a response, drew himself up and deliberately spat on the ground directly beside Darius's immaculately polished boot. The action was so unexpected, so contrary to the military bearing Whitcomb had otherwise displayed, that the crowd collectively gasped. "Kes, that's what I think of your service," he declared, loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. An insult to the uniform, a mockery of tradition. Stand down and remove yourself from this post. That's a direct order. For several seconds, the tableau held Whitcomb's aging frame vibrating with indignation. Darius maintaining his ceremonial position with perfect discipline, the crowd and security personnel frozen in the moment of transgression. The courtyard seemed suspended in time, the weight of centuries of tradition and decades of prejudice hanging in the air between the two men. Here, then, with a precision that spoke of thousands of hours of drill practice, Darius Cole moved. The movement was not a flinch or startled reaction, but the deliberate, controlled shift of a soldier making a conscious decision. His head turned exactly 90 degrees to face Whitcomb directly, the movement so precise it seemed mechanical rather than human. "Sir," Darius spoke, his voice carrying the measured authority of command, despite its respectful address. I believe we need to have a word." Whitcomb blinked, momentarily thrown by the unexpected response. "Lieutenant Colonel Alan Whitcomb," Darius continued, his voice remaining measured and calm despite the circumstances. "5th Regiment, retired, Distinguished Service Order for actions at Mirbat in 1972, Military Cross. From operations in Aden in 1967, you served under Colonel William Errington during the Cyprus emergency and were commended for leadership during the evacuation of British nationals from Aden." Whitcomb's eyes widened slightly, clearly surprised by the detailed knowledge of his service record. "My father," Darius continued, his stance now precisely at parade rest respectful but unintimidated, "Sergeant James Cole, served under your command in Aden. He spoke of your tactical acumen during the Al Mansura engagement. Said you were a brilliant strategist, somewhat rigid in your thinking." The revelation visibly shook Whitcomb, his certainty momentarily faltering as he processed the unexpected connection. "My heritage, since you've taken such interest, is indeed Sierra Leonean on my mother's side. My maternal grandfather, Daniel Touré, served in the Royal West African Frontier Force during the Second World War, fighting alongside British troops in Burma against the Japanese. He was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for actions that saved the lives of 3 British officers when their position was overrun." Darius's voice remained calm, neither defensive nor accusatory. "My father met my mother while stationed in Freetown after his service under your command. I was born in Portsmouth, attended the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, just as you did. San served 2 tours in the Balkans before selection for ceremonial duty." The security personnel had reached them but paused, recognizing that the situation had shifted from potential disruption to something more complex. The crowd had fallen completely silent, captivated by the unexpected exchange. "I understand, sir, that you come from a generation with different perspectives," Darius continued. "The world you trained to defend is not the same world we protect today." Whitcomb stood frozen, his earlier bluster evaporating under Darius's composed address. "I stand at this post because I met the same exacting standards required of every guard. This uniform has been earned through the same discipline and love of country that you displayed during your career." Darius's gaze remained level. "Your service deserves respect, Lieutenant Colonel. But the military values you upheld, honor, integrity, discipline are not diminished by my wearing this uniform. They are continued. The color of my skin does not make me less British than you, sir. My family has bled for the crown across 3 generations. We have earned our place in Britain's military heritage." The crowd remained silent, many visibly moved by the dignity of the response. Whitcomb's expression had transformed from anger to something more complex, confusion mixed with the uncomfortable recognition of beliefs being challenged. "I will not respond with anger, sir. That would dishonor this uniform. Instead, I ask you to reflect on what truly matters in military service, not the color of the soldier, but the quality of their character." Darius's voice took on a note of gentle but firm conclusion. "Now, sirs, one serviceman to another I must return to my duties. The tradition you claim to revere requires me to maintain my post with discipline and focus. I trust that, as a former officer who understands duty, you will respect that obligation." With the same precise movement that had broken his stance, Darius returned to his ceremonial position, eyes forward, posture perfect, the embodiment of military discipline restored as if the interruption had never occurred. Whitcomb stood motionless, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. The assured righteousness that had fueled his confrontation moments before had evaporated, leaving him visibly unmoored in the wake of Darius's composed response. "That's not," he began, then stopped, his usual command of language abandoning him. "You don't understand. Things were different. There were standards." His words lacked their previous conviction, sounding hollow even to his own ears. The crowd around them had grown tourists and locals alike, bearing witness to the unexpected exchange. Many glanced between the two men with expressions ranging from sympathy for Darius to embarrassment for Whitcomb. My regiment had traditions. Whitcomb tried again, attempting to recapture his authoritative tone. Centuries of tradition. It wasn't about, he gestured vaguely, unable to directly state what had seemed so clear to him minutes before. Darius maintained his ceremonial stance, eyes forward, the perfect embodiment of the discipline Whitcomb claimed to revere. This silent dignity seemed to unnerve the former officer more than any verbal response could have. "You don't belong here," Whitcomb said, but the declaration had lost its force, becoming almost questioning. "Your kind weren't meant for these positions." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the onlookers. Whitcomb turned toward the sound, his expression sharpening with defensive anger. "You don't understand either. None of you do. We had an empire. We had order. We had prejudice," countered a middle-aged man in a Royal Navy veteran's cap. "And we're better for moving beyond it." The security personnel who had been monitoring the situation stepped closer. "Sir, I think it's time you moved along," one stated firmly. "Yeah, you're disrupting the peace here," another added. Whitcomb looked from the security officer to Darius and back again, the realization slowly dawning that he had no allies in this confrontation. The certainties that had guided his life, the hierarchies he had taken for granted, were being rejected not just by the young guardsman, but by everyone around him. "This isn't right," he muttered, though his protest sounded increasingly like the complaint of a man who could no longer recognize the world around him. "Things shouldn't change like this." He took a step back, then another, his military bearings slipping as his shoulders slumped slightly. For a moment, he looked not like a decorated officer, but simply an old man confronting the obsolescence of his worldview, confused, defensive, and suddenly very alone. "The uniform means something," he said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "It has to mean something." "It does, sir," responded the security officer quietly. "Just not what you think it means." Whitcomb turned away abruptly, unable to face Darius any longer. The guardsman's composed dignity had accomplished what no amount of confrontation could have. It had forced Whitcomb to glimpse the bankruptcy of his own prejudice. "The world's gone mad," he declared, to no one in particular, as he began walking away. "Everything I fought for Gaetan," as he retreated across the courtyard. His posture gradually straightened, military discipline reasserting itself even as his worldview crumbled. Just before he passed through the gateway, he paused and looked back at Darius one last time. "Your father was a good soldier," he said, the admission clearly costing him something. "Whatever else I believe, to that much is true." With that final acknowledgment, as close to concession as his pride would allow, Whitcomb squared his shoulders and marched away, a relic of an era that Britain had chosen to leave behind.